Well, thank you very much, and I'm really thrilled to be here, and I have to tell you why, because being at Maine Media has absolutely changed my career, okay? It started off when Elizabeth Greenberg, 20 years ago, she hired me and she took a risk. She took a chance. She didn't really know who I was, and I'm here 20 years later, so something was working. After that, I had a slideshow, and Sig Harvey saw it, and she got me a job at the Art Institute of Boston for another 15 years, the second contact. My third contact was Tim Whalen, who had a bookstore in Rockport for 20 years. He re-educated me. He educated my students, and he introduced me to a student who was the publisher of the University of Maine Press, which is how I got my first book published. Now think about that. That is huge for anybody to be published by a university press. And in addition, I had 2 museum shows. Finally, after, this is not, it still goes on. This is the thing about Maine Media. It just goes on. And then about 10 years ago, David Lyman called up Konstantin Manos, who was my mentor and guide and best buddy, and he said to Costa, "Where in the world would you like to teach?" And Costa's like, "I want to go to Crete, Greece, and Stella has to go too." And I've been going ever since, okay? So, I have been blessed by Maine Media and by all of the new people who are here and all of my students. So thank you all very much. Now I can leave, right? This is the cover of the book that was published by the University of Maine Press, and it's called Al Sol. It means to the sun. I was influenced by my grandparents, who all fled hunger and war from Greece and came to New York first and ended up in Cambridge. And they talked about their village life every single day of my life. And it's the Greek word that I learned, the first Greek word that I could really pronounce, horio. Okay, that's how much they talked about it, and my father. And so for me, going to these villages and investigating what is life like without electricity and running water, how do people survive like that, was the question. Because by then I grew up in a town next to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there was running water and electricity. So that's what motivated me. I ended up, the cover of the book, actually Tim picked this picture, and I wonder if today, that was 20 years ago, if I would pick this picture, given the politics of the situation, etc. But this is Nicaragua. And I was talking to that little girl at the water's edge for quite some time. And slowly, I saw the boat go out, and I saw the raft going out, and finally she put her arms up, and if you look, you can see the horizon of the water going right to the armpit and to the other side of the t-shirt. That's something that I didn't see when I photographed it, but maybe it's an unconscious thing that we see? No? So anyway, I went back to Mexico because I was teaching again for Maine Media in Mexico also, these gifts, okay? I get there, and I had two cameras that were film cameras, so I grabbed some rolls from each camera to make sure the cameras were still working. This picture came out, and I went back to Nicaragua and gave it to her. She couldn't believe how beautiful she was. And if I did nothing else in my life, I could convince one little girl that she is indeed beautiful, but beyond the skin deep. But there were no mirrors. There's nothing. People don't have IDs in these places. There's no, nothing. So that was that's the cover of the book. This is also Nicaragua. And, this is what I learned from Manos a lot, how to cut up a frame into many different, I have the pole in the middle, I have a window on the right side, I've got a couple of hammocks, I've got a dog in the corner just for good luck, I've got, a woman in the window, and then I've got the shadows of the 2 people on the hammock also. This, sports fans, was 7 a.m. It used to get so hot there that we'd go out, they would go out to work and I would follow them. And the sun would rise, probably around 5, and then we'd work till 7 or 8 and then leave. This is, again, Nicaragua. It was shrimp season. I ate shrimp for a month, and I went on that diet, the diet from Miami. Anyway, foreground, middle ground, background. You see the big body in the frame here? I'm talking to students, so I want you to understand the framing of this. I have a big body in the right frame, and then I have the medium here with the boats, Same here. This is now I'm in Mexico. Mexico, I've been visiting these families for 35 years. So I was invited to a birthday party, and they are just really boring. This was a 1-year-old. They just scream, these kids, right? Then everybody else sits at a table like this and eats their cake, and then they leave. It's really bad. So I always would go and hang out with the kids, and the kids had found the light, and they were playing a pickup game of soccer. And it took me a while. I remember there were 2 or 3 rolls of film on this, to get this just right, with the shadow in the right, the kid with his arms out to receive the ball, the kick in the air, and there's also, I'm in the frame, if you can see it. Yeah. So that was Mexico. This also is Mexico. I was a Fulbright scholar. I lived in this house for 7 months, and photographing ritual, religious and cultural rituals with anthropologists. And this guy is burning the leaves because a religious procession is going to come by. And through the smoke comes the hope that this young new generation will be educated. His wife couldn't read or write, so like my grandmothers, they came from Greece, they couldn't read or write. So, but this was, one of my favorites. This also, I'm kicking myself every day when I see that I cut the nose off on the horse. I just, can't have that. This, okay, so I spent 2 weeks, looking for a live Jesus Christ on Good Friday, carry the cross. And I found him in Jojo, Oaxaca. And then the awful part was that they do these things in the middle of the day, so the light is just awful, high noon. But at this time it really worked for me because you can see his body through the white dress, whatever he's wearing. And it looks like he's starving, and, it's just a great metaphor for all of the suffering that had been going on and continues to this day in southern Mexico, Oaxaca. So that's what I did there. Okay, now we're going to Greece. And I did this book really as a love story to my parents and their parents, and I was up in the mountains, and it was in the middle of the winter, and it was a very foggy day, and it took me 2 weeks to find out why people hung bottles on these trees. I couldn't, I didn't speak enough Greek to understand what they were saying, but it's like the trees were up like this, and so by the springtime you have cover with the leaves if the branches are down. So, and that ended up being the cover of my book, Zoe. This, of course, now we're looking at a picture, it's like this young woman has been living with her fiancé, and yet the family comes and they bring the gifts and they ask for her hand in marriage, right? And if you see in the right here, in the right corner, there's a shadow of a woman. There's all the aunts and cousins and all of the people who live in that area watching. They have to bring enough gifts, they have to dress right, and it's a whole ritual. It's a really interesting, very interesting thing. Okay. This is a multi-level conversation. First of all, when I started in color on this book, I had been photographing with color commercially, but it's very different than if you want to make ART. So one of my friends said to me, color needs a friend. And if you can see, there's only blue and pink in this picture, which makes it very strong. A. B, it took me an entire month to make this picture. And so the story behind that is, it was I would go up the hill after the national nap time, and these were friends of my cousins, and they would always insist that I have coffee with them, and we'd have coffee, then I'd go visit my cousins. So I was there for a month, but I didn't speak enough Greek, and I was shy, and I didn't want to, get in their way. It turned out they loved being photographed, but I didn't know that at the time. It took me a month. But I finally got it, and finally, I must say, this little girl, she looks like she's screaming, right? And everybody has said this to me, and no, she's yawning, and that's her grandmother caressing her. So you never know what the truth is behind a photograph. And there she is again with her grandmother and her mother and her brother and a new sister 10 years later or more. I can't remember. I don't know the dates exactly. Rula. And then we did radio interviews. We became famous on the island. It was great, Okay, this is in the mountains of Greece. Somebody laughed and said, yeah, you set that up, right, Stella? And that's the other thing I really need to say. I don't set up pictures and I don't crop. And if I crop, it's like a millimeter, maybe just to straighten a picture or something, but honestly, no. These are the dregs of dinner. And Greece really helped me, and I think contemporary photography helped me to take pictures without people in them, which was really, a breakthrough for me. Photographing against the light with the shepherds. And that's the hallway, and you can tell that the house has been blessed by the priest because of the cross that was lit. Now we are in Mexico and the rituals. This is for Mardi Gras. The men put black paint on their bodies and they drink beer and they run around and it's theater. It's really kind of great. They're practicing for theater, actually. Then the women have one night a year when they can get dressed up and they can drink, and the husbands have to actually take care of the kids, which is, fabulous. This is more of these rituals. And this picture and the next one, they were taken 3 blocks from my house in Oaxaca. And I guess that's another thing to think about, like stuff that's close to you, actually physically, It's kind of interesting. And you get to know your places. So this is the home of the woman that I first met like almost 40 years ago. And these are all my pictures on the walls and the pictures that my students made there over the years also. And the whole rest of the house is papered in photos. So, and that's them. Juanita's the first woman standing there. This is her daughter, Claudia. I had been sitting on this tree trunk. This is her mother-in-law with whom she does not speak. This is, there's dirt everywhere, right? This is her daughter-in-law, and this is her daughter. But her daughter, when I met her, she was 12, So, yeah, I have a lot of families all over the world. This is a market in Merida. And I go to the markets all over the world, and it's really interesting. I mean, it's such back-breaking work. And this is like 9 a.m. They get up at 2, 3. They move all their produce. They put it in the truck. Then they have to unload it. By 9 a.m., they're exhausted. They've already worked a full day or two. Okay, so then I went to the beach. I went to the beach because we had COVID, and we were told, go to the beach, go outside, don't stay inside, wear a mask, stay 10 feet away. That was like a gift to me. So I went to Hollywood Beach in Florida, and that's this place. I really love the orange and blue together and just all of the other activity that spelled joy to me. If we were all suffering and people were sick, you could have a little joy. This is where Manos sent me also, Hollywood Beach. This is the theater that he photographed at all the time. And the beach on the wall there on the backdrop is actually behind it. It's really there. And again, and with these kids, I asked every single one of them hanging out, and you can see they're posing for me. And except this little kid coming by on his bike. But yeah. This is Revere Beach, where I used to go with my family when I was a kid. And this is the virtue of Leica. I don't need to pimp the camera, but if you already, are doing depth of field focusing, you just set the camera and wait for this action to come, and you hit the shutter. If you have a camera where it tries to hold on to the focus, by the time you hold on to the focus of the bird's gone. Right? Did that make sense? Okay, more or less. This is back at the beach, spring break. Back at Revere Beach, they're all over the place. Florida, LA. And this kid was, looking to get discovered. Everybody is doing that in LA, I think. This is back at the beach. So these guys, they were like posing for me. It took me over 2 hours. I waited them out. They finally crashed, and that's what I got. And if you can see in the lower left corner, there's somebody's head there. And she asked me specifically, I don't want to be in your picture. And I said, fine, can I photograph you from behind? She said, sure. There. LA. There's only so much you can do with the skate park after a while. All the images start looking alike, right? But I have to say, I loved it there. Whether or not I photographed the energy, the vibe, it's like a village there also. All these kids take care of each other. If you fall and break a bone, they're all there. If a child goes missing, they get the SWAT team out and they go out. I mean, it's really very nice in that regard. So these are all these beach images are what I made in those 2 years of COVID. Now, so then after COVID and after 2 years ago, I got really fed up with my color digital imagery. So I gave up the cameras, and I bought the same camera that I used 50 years ago at the San Francisco Art Institute. This is a $300 Yashica mat that keep getting refurbished, right? Because it's not made anymore. It's but it's out there in the universe. And I love this camera. So you have to look down and then out, and the image is flipped, and the glass is old, and the ground glass is old, and I'm old, and it makes for great pictures. So here we are. This is my final project. Well, this is the project I'm working on currently. All of these pictures, except for one, are like 3 and 4 blocks away from my house in Oaxaca. And I was seeing all these processions, and I know that there's a real anger in Mexico, there's anger in Greece, anger all over the world about people losing the ability to buy a house or live in their own town because of globalization. This is The Ghost Bride. That's the name of this project that I'm very pleased with, and I hope to publish a book with it. And this is all 120, and it's the same film, Tri-X. It was made 50 years ago. It's still being produced. These are friends of mine, artists. And then there's a lot of dancing around on the streets. People get married. They have processions for getting married, for getting divorced, for graduating kindergarten, for graduating high school. If there's a reason, this is a quinceañera, and there's a tourist in the window up there taking her picture also from behind. So this is Merida. This is, the devil for Mardi Gras. Any reason for any excuse is a good excuse. This is, a room with a view. The hot fire of the restaurant. This woman, she has a wonderful little family restaurant near my house also. And I would walk by, and the light would be like that every, day at 4 o'clock. Finally, I went to her and I said, can you wear one of your great dresses, and we'll just take these pictures, and I'll show you, and I'll send you, and I'll copy. She had all the dresses out. She was ready to go. I often wonder, do people think I'm crazy? No, they love being photographed. It's really kind of great. So, and this is the part of the procession at the church. The kids all making out 24/7. Yeah. This is a strange picture too. Okay, so this is right, the secret behind the photos, right? That's how they walk in these things, right? And let me tell you something, it's very hot there. So imagine being in a black suit like that, carrying that weight. It ain't easy. And then it says, hate the gringo. And that's why there's problems there with the globalization, both there and in Greece, I know for sure, places where I go, and I have a lot of friends. So that's my story, everybody. Thank you so much.
Well, this is my second time here at Maine Media teaching the workshop, The Healing Possibilities of Writing. And I'm going to give you, so the first time I did it on my own, and this time I'm doing it with my wonderful friend and mentor, Suzanne Strempick-Shea. And so we're already excited after one day about the stories that are emerging for our students, and we're excited to see where they take us. But I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey of how I came to this place of developing a workshop called The Healing Possibilities of Writing. So I'm going to start way back. 1985, I was living in maritime Canada. I was 13 years old. I was living a very idyllic life. My father was a renowned Canadian surgeon. He was the only surgeon in the Canadian Maritimes with the subspecialty of thoracic surgery. So he had a very thriving practice. My mom and dad were happily married. I had 3 brothers. All 4 of us were doing well academically and socially. And like I said, I was living in this very idyllic bubble, and life was good. And then one day, at the age of 42, my dad finished a lengthy surgery, stepped out of the operating room, and collapsed. And he had suffered a major heart attack. And so it was decided that he needed to have quadruple bypass surgery. And so he underwent the surgery, began the road to recovery. 8 months after his surgery, they got a phone call that the blood that he had been given was found to be contaminated with HIV. And so he was asked to come in for testing, and he tested HIV positive. There are many young people in this room, but also people more of my generation and beyond. You'll remember what the climate was like around HIV/AIDS in the early 1980s and 90s. And in Canada, it was no different than here. It was a culture that was, afraid of this disease. The stigma surrounding it was fueled by misinformation and, homophobia and all sorts of other cultural, factors influencing it. My dad, who was at the height of his medical career, knew very little about the disease and anticipated that he would be, like most people we were seeing suffering from AIDS, would be dead within months. And so in an attempt to normalize our lives as much as possible and maintain a level of, kind of consistency and safety for our family, he decided his illness would be a secret, and one that we would all keep. And so he had no idea that he would be able to live with this virus. People didn't know that people were living for long periods of time with the virus. And so he lived for 10 years. And between the ages of 13 and 23, I had to maintain this secret. 6 months before he died, my mom and dad wrote a book and published it. And so the secret was out. The story had been told, and that was the official story of this experience. And then my father died in 1995 of AIDS-related complications. I carried kind of the silence around this story, the secrecy around this story, beyond them publishing their book, because by that time I had gotten married, I'd moved 1,000 miles away, and so I wasn't there for the big reveal. And so kind of when the rules changed about whether we were allowed to talk about this or not, I didn't really adapt to those rules. And so it was a story I carried pretty silently for another almost 20 years. And gradually, I started realizing, there's something to look at in this experience. I wasn't quite sure what, but it was one of those things. I always kind of talk about it as though I was carrying this experience like in a box that I was just kind of dragging with me everywhere I went. And over time, when you're dragging a box, it starts picking up dirt. And eventually, I couldn't drag it anymore, and I had to turn around and kind of pay attention to it. So fast forward almost 20 years to 2013, when I enrolled in the Stone Coast MFA program at the University of Southern Maine, thinking, maybe this is the time that I can start exploring this story. Maybe there's something more to this story than the official version that I have to tell. So I want you to picture this scenario. Our MFA, when I was at Stone Coast, was housed in the Stone House, which was a beautiful historic mansion in Wolf's Neck State Park. And all of our classes were in these kind of cramped rooms. It was a low residency MFA, which meant that we went for these 10-day intensive residency periods where we were doing seminars and workshops and classes. And so all of our classes were kind of in these upper level rooms that were very crammed. And so imagine all of these chairs being in a room about half this size, and there's no aisle, right? And so there was a visiting writer who was there doing a talk. It was day 2 of my very first residency. I was sitting on the very end of the last row. And so she was talking about something kind of as innocuous as travel writing, I think. It wasn't anything intensive at all. And our program was a multi-genre program, which meant we had poets, we had, fiction writers, we had pop fiction writers, we had nonfiction writers. And so all of these writers kind of coming to these seminars. And so before she began, she kind of said, I just kind of want to take a poll about what everybody's writing. And so she started going around the room, and she started at the back, and she started weaving her way. And, people were like, I'm writing magical realism about, sorcery and whatever. Somebody else, I'm writing a collection of nature poems, and it kind of kept going on. And all of these people very confident in the stories. People saying things like, my WIP is something and something and something. And it took me about halfway down to recognize that WIP stood for work in progress. I wasn't even that advanced in knowing. And so I started feeling kind of, as more and more people were sounding more and more confident in the things that they were writing, I felt this growing tension, and recognizing I'm going to be the last one to speak, and it's getting closer and it's getting closer. And I just, kind of felt this tension rising. And she got to me. I opened my mouth to speak and just started sobbing. And historically, I was not a public crier. I was somebody, I say that composure was my superpower. And so it was mortifying for me to have this experience. I think I mumbled something like, writing about my dead dad, and kind of hoped she would move on. But what ended up happening for the next 90 minutes, I was trapped in this chair because there was no aisle. I was trapped in this chair, crying, unable to stop, sitting next to people I had met the day before who were just kind of inadvertently digging through their bags looking for tissue. And I just couldn't stop crying. And I realized in that moment when I was asked, what is your story? I had no idea. I had no idea, because it wasn't something I had ever been able to talk about. It wasn't something I'd ever had the chance to articulate. And so I kind of made it through the rest of that residency with a few more moments of what I called the inconvenient crying, at workshop tables and other moments, and kind of asked myself the question, what am I doing here? Why would anybody want to do something like this? Why am I putting myself through this? And as part of the low residency program, after the residency, you spend 6 months kind of working on your own with a faculty mentor. And I was very fortunate to have a mentor at the beginning who kind of said to me, Melanie, don't think big project. Just start writing what feels important. So I didn't have to kind of say where's the beginning of my story? Where does it start? I just started writing things that were resonating in my life at that moment without really having any sense of direction. But there would be times that I would be sitting at my computer, by myself, literally feeling like if I go any deeper into this memory, I'm going to disintegrate. I'm going to just melt onto the floor. And I know that sounds kind of hyperbolic, but that's what it felt like. I'm not going to make it. And so in the process of doing this residency and doing this MFA, we had to read a lot in our genre. And I was choosing a lot of books that were, about trauma, about grief, about illness, about loss. And I kept reading these books and thinking, how in the world did these writers do what they did and create these beautiful works of art and get to the place where they had a finished story? And I kept thinking, how am I going to get there? And so I had, as part of the MFA program, we had to do a project that was different than our creative thesis. So I was kind of trying to work my way into the story that eventually became my memoir. But at the same time, we had to do more of kind of a critical reflection paper in the midst of our MFA. And so I decided, maybe I could talk to a few of these writers and I could ask them, how did they survive? So I thought I might write an article. So I started reading other, articles that had been written about the writers, and nobody was asking them the questions that I needed answered. Nobody was saying, what was it like to write about the death of your child? How did you possibly make it through reliving that scene of abuse and trauma? And I kept thinking, how in the world did they do this? But the interviewers were asking them things like, where do you like to write? What's your favorite kind of pen? And I kept thinking, no, ask them the real question. And then I thought, well, why can't I? And so I started talking to some writers, and I thought maybe a few would, kind of answer my queries, and I could write an article on something about the psychological journey of writing difficult material or digging into difficult memories. But I ended up connecting with writers. I ended up connecting with 18 contemporary memoirists, all of whom were more than generous and didn't just say, send me a few questions via email. They said, come to my home and, we'll sit down and talk, or let's meet for dinner. And so I had all of these amazing experiences of, getting to talk to these writers. And with every conversation, I felt like they were almost breathing oxygen into my lungs, because they were telling me again and again, consistently, it is hard. You're going to go into dark places as you write, but you will come back. You're going to come back. And when you do, you're going to recognize something in your story that you didn't recognize before. You're going to understand something in your story that you didn't understand before. And I kept kind of listening, and I wasn't at that place where I was recognizing anything or understanding anything. And I kept thinking, but they said it would happen. They said it would happen. And so that's how my first book actually developed. It's called Writing Hard Stories, and it's profiles of my interviews with these writers. But I really attribute that and talking to these writers and making connections with these writers who had all done the work before I had, of helping me get to the place where I could really start facing the memories that I needed to face to write this story, to start understanding what the story was I was really trying to tell and what I was trying to understand. And so what eventually happened to me was what they said would happen, that I would kind of reach a different understanding of my story. I think most memoirists start writing about our experiences not because we want to be published authors, not because we want to be famous, but because something has happened in our lives that we want to try to find meaning in. We want to understand something about it. And so that was my impetus for beginning. That's my students' impetus this week. They're trying to understand these diverse experiences that they've been through and figure out what they're about. And then eventually, though, what I began to understand is there's something in my very personal story that goes beyond the personal, that reaches into something broader. So while my circumstances were very unique, I started to understand, what family doesn't have secrets, right? How many of you have had to carry some kind of family secret? Who has never suffered in silence in some way and felt the isolation and loneliness of that experience? And I thought, if something in my story can connect to somebody who's out there who isn't ready to be able to voice the secret that they've had to carry, or to, express the pain that they've had to shroud in silence, then maybe it creates value in what I'm doing beyond just the personal understanding that I reached. And so that's kind of what pushed me beyond the just writing for myself to understand, but how do I make this a story that becomes accessible to other people? And so 10 years after starting my MFA, I ended up publishing A Hard Silence. And so I have had the opportunity over the last year and a half to go and have conversations like this with multiple audiences. And I can't tell you how many times at the end of a talk and a reading, I'll have somebody come up and say to me, I really identify. And then they'll tell me a story that's completely different than my own, right? But there's something that they found that resonated in my experience with their experience. And so I've started to kind of understand that there's value in these stories. And I had to carry this story in silence. It was lonely. It was an experience that I couldn't talk about with anybody. And suddenly now I'm out here talking about it all the time. And it's creating this sense of connection. I feel like a more authentic person than I ever was. Because, when you can't talk about important things in your life, there's always kind of this barrier that's sitting there. When I wrote this book and started talking about it, that barrier went away. And now, I kind of have these very authentic experiences. And so back to the healing possibilities of writing. It's not about, making everything better. I still carry the deep grief of the loss of my dad. I still carry a lot of the confusion that surrounds that story and that experience. But I'm carrying it differently than I used to carry it. It's not the very, very heavy burden that it once was for me. It's now something that I can hold in my hands, that I can look at and say, I made this out of this thing that had been so traumatic in my life. And I recognize that by making it, I'm giving other people a chance to find meaning in their stories. And so I'm going to just read you a couple of things from this book. One of the things that was unique in my experience was we couldn't talk about it with people outside our family. But my younger brother was only 8 when my dad was diagnosed, and my parents decided not to tell him. And they didn't tell him for 7 of those 10 years. And so we couldn't really talk about it inside our family either. And so a lot of what I was learning about what was kind of the trajectory for my dad, what was going to happen, I was learning through the media, I was learning through, kind of public announcements. And so it was this also kind of a lot of the confusion of trying to figure out what was happening. So this is a chapter called So Little Information, So Much Fear. I paused on the landing, my hand resting on the heavy door handle, and turned to wave to Mr. Renner, my next-door neighbor. He stood on his front step, the inside light framing his silhouette, and watched to make sure I got in the house all right. "Good night," he said, and turned into his entryway. Once I'd passed over the threshold and pulled the door closed, the deadbolt secured, I sifted through the bills he'd handed me on my way out. $30. Not bad for a night of babysitting, especially since William and Ryan, 2 and 4, had fallen asleep by 8. The rest of the evening, I'd luxuriated on their family room couch and watched St. Elmo's Fire on cable, munching the salt and vinegar chips and drinking the Coke he and Mrs. Renner had left for me. Except for the stove light casting a glow from the kitchen, the house was dark and still. Mom and Dad didn't typically wait up when I was babysitting next door. I slipped off my Keds and padded barefoot across the tile in the front hall to turn off the light. I headed upstairs, my feet quiet on the carpet. My room was the one at the top of the stairs. I tiptoed inside, switched on my bedside lamp, and closed the door gently behind me. The alarm clock on my desk read a little after midnight, but I was still wired from the caffeine. I grabbed a pair of worn sweats from a crumpled heap of clothes in the corner and pulled them on, along with an oversized t-shirt. Propping my pillows against the white headboard, I nestled under my down comforter. I reached for my book and found the dog-eared page in Jane Eyre, where I'd left off, and returned to the budding romance between the impressionable governess and Mr. Rochester. By 12:45, my eyes were heavy and the words started to smear on the page. The details of Jane's complicated history with Mrs. Reed and the revelations of her inheritance from her uncle began to get muddy, and I decided to put down the book. I hadn't brushed my teeth, so I climbed out of bed and opened my door, careful not to bang it against the doorstop. I slipped into the hallway and started toward the bathroom I shared with my brother David. My eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dark, and I ran my hand along the wall to guide my path. A soft moan stopped me mid-stride. At first, I didn't realize its source, and for a few seconds, I was not certain I'd heard anything. Then, another moan sounded, louder this time, followed by a creaking mattress spring and rhythmic, heavy breathing. The sounds were coming from behind my parents' closed bedroom door. Recognition burned through me. I was standing smack in the middle of every teenager's worst nightmare. Indecision froze me to the spot as the now mortifyingly clear noises resonated through the hallway. If I continued to the bathroom to brush my teeth, I would alert my parents that I was awake, and chances were that one of them would come out to check on me. Totally out of the question, I decided. Heat scalded my cheeks at the thought of facing either of them in this awkward moment. I clapped my hands over my ears, wishing I could somehow utter the la-la-las that would block the sounds now searing themselves into my brain without drawing attention to myself. I crept back to my bedroom, and in the slowest and most careful of movements, I inched the door closed. I turned off the lamp and hid beneath my comforter. I squeezed my eyes shut against the darkness, discouraging images that were trying to take shape in my mind. Embarrassment prickled my skin, but something else had opened up inside of me, a relentless and looming question that wouldn't stop repeating in my mind. What if he infects her? I absorbed this new terror as it washed over me. The fact that I knew Dad was HIV positive had materialized for my parents without fanfare. There wasn't a moment when they formally acknowledged it, but an unspoken understanding had formed between us. On rare occasions, they'd included me in their conversations. From the few fragments I'd gathered and their answers, the few times I'd been bold enough to ask about Dad's condition, I knew that after Dad found out he was HIV positive, Mom got tested too. Though the infected blood had circulated through his system for 8 months before he knew about it, by some miracle, Dad hadn't passed the virus to my mother. I knew how AIDS spread. The American Red Cross had been running a series of PSAs called Rumors Are Spreading Faster Than AIDS to fight against the ongoing AIDS myths. Every time I turned on the television to one of the main networks, I heard celebrities like Robert De Niro and Meryl Streep saying things like, "There isn't a single case of AIDS on record caused by casual contact," and "Find out the facts." I knew the facts. You couldn't get AIDS from someone by shaking hands or sharing a water glass. You could get AIDS from someone by having sex and sharing needles. I knew about condoms. We'd learned about them in school during a part in health class that talked about protecting against sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS, just last month. Just last month, on one of my favorite shows, The Hogan Family, Jason Bateman's character, David, bought a box of condoms because he was thinking of having sex with his girlfriend. And once, when I was snooping in Mom's bedside table, I found a stack of the small, square packages at the back of her drawer. Then, I couldn't get beyond the mortification of the discovery to think about their use. But now, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Remember, my health teacher cautioned, condoms are not 100% effective. The safest way to protect yourself against AIDS is to choose not to have sex. I'd read some of the tragic public stories in the news magazines my parents subscribed to of people transmitting the disease to their partners before finding out they themselves were infected. But my parents knew about Dad's infection. Could I trust that they were doing everything they could to prevent that same kind of tragedy? I wasn't so sure. Don't let Mom get sick. I can't lose you both. Don't risk it. Please, please, please be safe. I turned my face into my pillow, clapped my hands over my ears again, and this time I cried out, certain that no one would hear me. Another thing that has been incredibly healing, and I talk about this to my students as well, is when you're writing about someone, you get to spend time with them. And writing this book gave me the opportunity to bring my dad alive on the page. And so I'm just going to read a little bit about my dad, because part of, wanting to tell the story was there's a cultural story to tell, but also my dad was a brilliant man whom I loved deeply, whose life ended way too soon. And in writing this book, I'm able to bring him to other people and share him. This is a chapter called He Was My Favorite. When I sit down to write a simple description of my dad, I get stuck. The words I scatter into my sentences in my efforts to give him definition: brilliant, wise, confident, funny, loving, hardworking, compassionate, generous, proud, respected, guarded, complicated, feel stiff and distancing. In my mind, my dad lives as a medley of images and captured moments that order and reorder themselves to shape, as best they can, some of the contours of the man he was. In no particular order, here are some highlights. Dad didn't like his coffee too hot. No matter where we were, he'd scoop an ice cube from his water glass and stir it into his steaming cup until it dissolved in the dark liquid before taking his first sip. He could tie a fly onto a fishing line with one hand. He'd take naps on the family room couch with his glasses still propped on his face. He had a secret nickname for almost everyone: comical, often unflattering, and bordering on offensive, and inevitably spot on, that would end up sticking for good. When my brother Mark brought his first girlfriend home from college, Dad christened her the Pickle, because that's where she ranked on his scale of sweetness. On many nights when he was on call at the hospital, he'd rush home, still wearing his green scrubs, to sit down with us for a family dinner. Sometimes he'd be late, and other times he'd be there only a few minutes before his beeper would sound, beckoning him for a surgical consult, but he always did his best to show up. Canned peas on toast, a combination that still makes my stomach turn, were his comfort food. He hated his name, and when he knew he was dying, discharging his characteristic humor, he made my brothers and me promise that we wouldn't get all sentimental and name any of our children Orville in homage to him. He twiddled his thumbs when he was bored and often made a point of showing me that he was doing it, letting me know that it was okay for me to be bored too. When I still had my baby teeth, he'd take the first bite of my apple to break the skin for me. He had a way of buoying my confidence with his. He was known to press the test button on his hospital pager as an excuse to get up and leave when the sermon at church got too long. He loved white cake with jam filling and butter icing. It was with his fault we never got perfect attendance in Sunday school, because on those Sunday mornings when the sun's early sparkle promised a beautiful day, a drive to the beach or a hike in the woods often felt like a better option to him than filing into a church pew. Once, after his diagnosis, he watched a mosquito bite his arm and turned to me with a wry smile and slowly said, "Joke's on the mosquito." He scratched the inside of his ears with his car keys. His hands were large and strong and steady. He liked my hair short, and when I was 11, he bribed me to cut off the uneven layers I was trying to grow out by letting me get my ears pierced 3 years earlier than I'd been promised. He had a deep crease between his eyebrows from years of intense concentration in the operating room. The first time he gave me a driving lesson, he made me cry before we'd even left the driveway because he got so frustrated when I couldn't master idling in first gear on a hill. The deepest expression of his faith could be found in his music. He was a gifted pianist and played with the ease of someone speaking his first language. He'd come home from a long day at the hospital and sometimes play for an hour or more straight, transitioning seamlessly from one piece to the next without ever looking at a sheet of music. The stored notes from his memory flowed through his fingers like a prayer. He despised the Christmas carol Little Drummer Boy. At my brother Michael's wedding, he modeled his thank you speech to my sister-in-law Yvonne's parents after a Baptist three-point sermon, saying simply, "Thanks for the day, thanks for the dinner, thanks for the daughter." He adored my mother and never let a day go by without letting her and us know it. When we were little, he could stop my brothers and me mid-fight just by taking the wooden spoon out of the kitchen drawer and laying it on the counter. He taught me how to dive off the diving board by singing the title song to the musical Oklahoma, exhorting me to hit the water by the time he got to the final A, when the lyrics spelled out the state name. He was a gifted speaker with a natural ability to make people pay attention, but on matters of the heart, he was often silent. On Valentine's Day, he'd bring home a rose for Mom and a rose for me. He used to call cocktail onions roly-poly onions. He sent me a letter soon after I'd left for college telling me that things were going downhill in my absence and that as a result of Mom's new diet, he and my younger brother David were starving. He'd nestle me close on the piano bench when I was little, my feet dangling above the floor, and let me rest my hands on top of his while he played. His sense of humor was quick and dry and irreverent, and he could make me laugh harder than anyone else. When I called from New Hampshire to tell my parents that Chris and I were engaged, he didn't speak at all, and when my mom said, "Orv, say something nice," he got mad that she called him out and hung up the phone. He was never afraid to make his opinion known. Once, on an outing with my grandmother, he grabbed a hat that he loathed right off her head and threw it out the car window. He was a nature guy and found solace in fresh air, the stillness of a fishing stream, a sail on open water. He once wrestled our dog to the floor to pry a chicken bone from between his teeth. In restaurants, he'd challenge me to lemon-sucking contests, each of us shoving a wedge between our teeth and trying to keep a straight face. He grounded me from church youth group when I was failing calculus my senior year of high school. He was the surgeon on call, charged with being at the ready at the hospital for the visits to Moncton in 1984 of both Pope John Paul II and Queen Elizabeth II. In my first month of college, he stayed on the phone with me for over 2 hours to help me understand the American two-party system so I could write a paper for my political science class. His approval meant everything to me. He disapproved of all of my boyfriends. He approached purchasing a car with the precision of a nuclear scientist, meticulously researching his options, weighing the pros and cons of the features and specs, and determining a price threshold before ever setting foot on the lot. He was a man of abiding faith and wrestled with deep doubts. He said to me once, "I don't think I'd be a Christian if I thought Christians were what Christianity was all about." On Christmas morning, he always made a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice just for me. He wore the same Tilly hat every time we went sailing. When he got sick, he founded his own private Don't Sweat the Small Stuff club called WGAS, Who Gives a Shit, and let me become an honorary member. On my wedding day, while we stood at the back of the chapel waiting for our cue, he whispered this effort to calm my nerves. "It's not too late. One word, and we're out of here." He wouldn't get up and file us out of a restaurant after we'd been seated if it didn't meet his expectations. He could write limericks on the fly. When we were little and the hour-long drive to our cottage felt endless, he'd make up stories about the ghost of the McLaughlin Road, named for the longest section of the trip. One of his favorite expressions was, "Lighten up, fella." He had zero tolerance for pretension. When his mind was made up, it was rare that anyone could change it. He scared me a little bit. He set expectations for us that were almost impossible to meet. When Bailey, our golden retriever, had to be put to sleep while I was away at my last year of college, he called me afterwards and said, "If I had my choice, I think that's how I'd like to go too." He knew pretty much everything about everything. We all understood he was the guy in charge, and his way was the one and only way. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight too. It's interesting. My photographs, in many ways, are going to be the exact opposite of Stella's, because you won't find a single person in any of them. And pretty much the only people I ever took pictures of were my daughter, and now she's 18 and resists more. So because I have a lot of different obsessions, like printing, what I'm teaching this week, and the bookmaking, but they don't really lend themselves well to the presentation format, at least in ways that I've succeeded. So I decided to kind of talk about my photographic journey. And, I kind of, started off in many ways as kind of a classic landscape photographer. And then over time, I kind of went different directions. And I thought it'd be maybe beneficial to kind of show the path that I took with doing that. And so I do have a few pictures from those early stages. And I also want to mention that like Stella, Maine Media has been incredibly influential in my photographic practice and my artistic practice. And really, when I audited Brenton Hamilton's history of photography class 18 years ago, like 2 weeks before my daughter was born. I didn't know it was going to lead into this. I ended up taking many classes as a student and eventually transitioned to teaching classes, and it's become a big part of my life in pretty much all aspects. So it's been, and the funny thing is, not to kill too much time here, but limited time, is that when I moved here, I was very interested in photography, and we moved to Camden, and I had no idea this place ever existed. It was just, I was totally oblivious. So it was pure luck that I lived 7 minutes away from here. So, okay, so moving on here. I always, I discovered early on that I resonated most with color photography, and I also found early on, about 18 years ago, the square format. And so that really those have been my obsession in terms of photographic practice that entire time. And I also, early on, kind of maybe connected to the NASA engineer part. I kind of went back to one of my earlier obsessions, which was the night sky. And so I spent many years pursuing night photography pretty seriously, and I taught night photography here and for many years as well. But what I discovered, somewhat by necessity and somewhat by desire, that I really was more interested in working in project form and kind of building a body of work around a central theme, whatever that might be. And so I transitioned into doing that it was 2016, so what is that, 9 years? No, that's, yeah, like 9-10 years ago. And so the first project that I worked on was kind of a spin-off of both of those things, the landscape and the night sky. And it's this project called Adventures in Celestial Mechanics. And in this project, I basically went out every month and photographed the full moon rising or setting from somewhere in the Maine landscape. And I kind of went all over the place. And I did this for probably 5 or 6 years. And, my daughter at this point was quite young, and I would take her with me and try to entertain her, because my wife had a lot of travel back then, and so I'd have to bring my 5-year-old with me when I went to photograph these things. And it all worked out. And I let her trip the shutter sometimes to keep her, I tell her when to go. And so this project, for me, it was very interesting because I never had spent so long photographing one subject. And my aesthetic and the way I wanted to photograph it changed throughout that process, and it kind of became more and more minimal as I went through it. And I also did a lot of research in terms of cultural aspects of different moons, because every culture across the world has, essentially affiliations with different moons at different times of the year. Like the August moon means one thing to Native American tribes of North America versus in China versus in Australia, and a lot of it depending on obviously the weather and the climate in different regions, and also just other cultural aspects. And so each one of these moon pictures carries a name from one of the. I pick a cultural name that I think really fits with the image, and that, frankly, that's kind of poetic too. I like ones that are pretty interesting. And so this project was kind of my longest lasting project, just in terms of the number of years I did it. And I stopped, actually I started before. I ended it in 2016, so that's when I ended it. But one of the things, I did do one other picture last year, because during the time I was doing this, I got one lunar eclipse photograph I took up in Acadia National Park. And there were 4 lunar eclipses 6 months apart that were visible up here, and the first 3 were wipeouts because of clouds, but the last one I got lucky. And then last year, I was able to get the solar eclipse, and so that the moon as a disk. So that was kind of the missing piece I didn't know I was missing until I got it. So I'm working right now on putting this all into a book form in terms of making a handmade artist book out of it. Another project I was working on simultaneously was what I call the pyrotechnic series. And these were all, essentially, they're abstracted fireworks. I would go, because I had a young child, to all the different fireworks displays here in Maine, and I would just take pictures from the crowd and kind of work on them in basically abstracting them in different ways. One was I cropped in very close, so you kind of the closer you get in, the less it seems like fireworks. And obviously the black and white is another way of making it seem less like fireworks. But what I was looking for were things that looked like natural forms, and different. They were evocative. This also kind of led me to start really experimenting more with papers, because when I first was doing this project, I was using kind of my standard paper, which was a very nice luster paper. But then when I started making photographs like this that seemed much more like drawings or etchings, I realized that paper was no longer a fit. And so then it started what's become a big project for me, is always trying to come up with the perfect paper for all my projects. And so this project kind of led to that discovery, which of course has impacted everything afterwards as well. One thing I've discovered in kind of working on these long-term projects, but in a serial fashion, in the sense that I usually don't start a new project until I'm kind of finished with another one, or I can maybe only do two at once in my head at once. But sometimes there'll be an image in one project that will lead to the next one. And this photograph was one of my last ones of my fireworks project. But when I saw this, it made me think of the night sky. So that led me to the next project, Harmony of the Spheres. And here I'd gotten dissatisfied with traditional night photography. I'd been teaching it and taking it, and I was starting to feel like everything looked the same. So I was trying to find my own twist on a kind of a classic photographic genre. And so I decided to take some of the aesthetic and skills I developed in the fireworks series and apply those to the night sky. And so this one is these images are a little harder to describe, in the sense that the combinations they're all photographs I've taken of the night sky and abstracted either by making them negatives, like white, white becomes black, black becomes white. But I'm also compositing multiple images together. So you're getting star trails going different directions, you're getting some things moving, some things points, and you start getting these different aspects. And so I started building this out as for me, kind of a new and it was much more fun for me to do this sort of work than to, keep on kind of building out my more classic night photography. And some of these became really extreme, and the computer I had was difficult. Like this photograph, each one of those darker black dots is a photograph of the North Star taken from my driveway, and here in Maine. So it was a star field that had the North Star, and there are 364 photographs stacked together here that I kind of just by eyeballing it, I just kind of placed them all together to kind of create something that was much more, closer to abstract expressionism than it is to photography. And so this is kind of when I started really trying to push what, for me personally, like I consider photography to be a pretty big tent in terms of the kind of things that are included within it. And I wanted to keep on trying to push the limits of it with what I was doing. So I always wanted to have it at its core to be photography. Like these are all photographs I've taken myself, but they became something much more, a long way away from what I was taking, when I first started. So something else that I'm really cognizant of is I'm trying to do a lot of varied bodies of work, kind of what I'm interested in doing, but I want there to be a thread that kind of ties them together as well, because I think it's difficult to do, but I like that sort of challenge, and I'm sure that sometimes it's more successful than others in doing that, but the square format certainly helps tying together, and I have the circle in the square is something I also like. This is when I started moving the night photography series into color, and which I guess is kind of obvious. But this is actually a photograph of the sun. I had a situation where this astronomer down in southern Maine said, I have this great solar telescope, but I don't have a very good camera. Would you be willing to hook your fancy camera up to my telescope? And nothing would make me happier, actually. We actually took a photograph of the space station passing in front of the sun and printed up this giant picture for the school where he worked. And so that's a photograph of the sun, and in a large print, you could see all the sunspots. I took out the space station for this picture, but the space station, if the sun was about 40 inches across, the space station was about 2 inches across. You could see the solar panels. It was really pretty amazing shot. And he had it all planned out, like this second it'll be in front of the sun, and we can get this picture. It was a lot of fun. And so so color. I kind of always go back to color as my happy space in a lot of ways. And then I tried something even a little weirder, which is I was trying to mash up my moon pictures and the compositing with the star trails and also kind of false color, and kind of a whole nother body of work I built on this. And so I always envisioned the night photography project to have a bunch of essentially chapters within it that are all distinctly different and still tied together as well. Right after that, I had my artist residency in Iceland in 2018, and really as a result of that trip, I started to transition my work more towards environmental advocacy and climate, and specifically climate change. And so the Iceland trip was the instigator for that. And so this is a project that I worked on. I took the photographs in Iceland and the next year in the Northern Rockies for the most part, but I turned this into a handmade book that I did as part of the book artist residency here at Maine Media. And this was my attempt to try to broaden the reach of advocacy photography, because what I wanted to do in this project was basically take straight photographs, like kind of landscape photographs that show beautiful things that are threatened by climate change. And I basically built a conceptual wrapper around it. In a sense, I wrote a lot of text to go with each one. That was basically, the whole project was built as, and the book was built by me as, from the point of view of a museum exhibition 100 years in the future, looking back at what we hadn't lost. So I wrote text for each one of these pictures that talked about, this is so-and-so glacier, it melted away in 2089. You know, I kind of based things on scientific articles, and it wasn't just glaciers. You know, as you'll see in here, it's kind of a variety of things. But so that was kind of my first attempt at doing environmental advocacy with my photography, and you'll see as I go through the last couple of years of work, that was a big part of it. And this was kind of the starting of this new thing. And I did things in different ways, but and I'm still not actually done with this project. I mean, I'm still working on making more books on it, you know, larger scale books and everything else. But there's still a lot of places to go see, you know, and to hear a photograph and include on this. I modeled this on, if you're familiar with the, what are called the Great Western Surveys, you know, like in the late 19th century, 1870s or so, different photographers like Timothy O'Sullivan went out to the West and photographed all these natural landscapes, really for the hired by the U.S. Geological Service, and really for the purpose of, these are resources we could exploit. And so the idea was behind this project was, this is the opposite, where a government organization is going to go and try to record these things, to record them before they're lost. It was kind of the premise behind that. So after this, and this was kind of once we got into the COVID era, I guess everybody has a COVID project they started. And so for me, this was it. And so this was the next iteration of my environmental advocacy projects, where I wanted to move away from the straight photographs and away from the text-based support. And what I did for this project was, this is called The Memory of Nature, I would basically take photographs, again, of threatened landscapes, make a print of them. This is where it helps being your own printer. And then I light them on fire, and then take the burn print, superimpose it over an unburned print, and rephotograph it. And there's the obvious metaphorical aspects of the burning landscapes and everything else, and there's just an aesthetic beauty, really, to the burn lines and everything else. And I kind of liked introducing that level. As someone, the ex-engineer, I was happy to kind of introduce a level of chaos into my work and uncertainty, and letting letting things loose a little bit and see what happens, and finding some really beautiful results out of that. And so, and these are going like, this is a photograph, for example, from McGonagall Lake, which is just in Camden and Lincolnville, and just the snow on the ice, and so trying to transform them into something else, and there's a lot of experimentation. I just do all this burning in my backyard. My wife is always insistent that I not get too close to the house while this is happening. I try to do it actually in the winter when I can, if the fire gets out of control a little bit, I can kick snow on top of it. So it's like, to kind of help it from. Sometimes if they catch too much, they'll burn. You don't have anything left to photograph. So but there's lots of little scraps and ash all over my studio still from this. It's like when you have glitter, when you have a kid and you have glitter, the glitter is always there for the rest of your life. The ash is the same way in my studio, just from all the little scraps. And then, so a couple years ago, I can't remember exactly, maybe 2.5 years ago, I wanted to kind of push this into even further from kind of a traditional photograph. And so here, this project is, again, climate change based, and it's the disappearing Maine winter. So 2 winters ago, or 3 winters ago, when we really didn't have much of a winter, what I did was I took pictures of snow and ice from, lakes and streams and oceans around here, made prints of them, lit them on fire, and then collaged them together to try to make things that are kind of evocative of, again, landscapes or night skies or anything else. But again, it's kind of the idea behind this is essentially making landscapes from the ashes of the old. This is kind of, again, trying to find a way of kind of embodying the rising temperatures and burning into a photographic print. And it's been a lot of fun experimenting with this and trying to come up with it. And I have my little setup in my studio to I use magnets to hold these together and then photograph it. And they're actually, some of these are quite tiny. They're probably 3 or 4 inches across, and kind of photograph it. And so when I do a large print out of them, you can see very, at this scale, you probably can't really see the burn lines as much. You can see where the edge is, but you don't actually see that it's a burn. But on a larger print, you can do that. And so I'm not done. Again, these last couple of projects, I have a hard time ending projects. They kind of linger in my head. And it's like maybe there's like this one unfinished thing I want to kind of do, but I'm not sure what it is yet. But I'm still experimenting. I'm still trying to find the new one. And sometimes that's what happens is like once I find a new thing I'm excited about, then I can kind of put to bed the old one. And so I just want to show you a couple of things I'm working on. Something I started, I guess last year, end of last year, was a different way of essentially modifying the prints and writing an image. Was essentially, again, these are all pictures of the ocean, and red, kind of like burning. Red has a lot of connotations that can be useful, and really kind of I wanted to make things that were a bit more apocalyptic in a way in terms of the images themselves. And so I'm experimenting with that. I'm trying to turn that into a kind of a small book. But it's really these start off as pictures of the ocean, and kind of transformed in different ways into something else. And I'm also experimenting with this, where I'm kind of mashing up some of these other burn ideas, where I'm taking the unburned print and burning a hole in it, and then putting the red images behind it, versions. And so it's actually really difficult to try to get these things all to line up, properly, because it's the same image, the same size behind, but the paper warps as it gets burned and everything else. And so I've learned a lot of kind of useless skills for that are hard to apply to anything else with this burning project. And but I'm excited about how some of these is coming out, is trying to find other ways of representing image form, and in the same image, kind of both what's at risk and what, and that it's essentially danger also, and trying to show that in the same photograph. Another permutation that I've been playing around with, and this is actually pretty recent, is I've always been, despite my obsession with the square format, I've also really interested in vertical panoramics, and I've always wanted to do something, kind of a lot of the papers I print on and a lot of the aesthetic that I resonate with is more like the, kind of the different, the reminiscent of like the Chinese landscapes on the vertical scrolls and that sort of thing. And so I've been trying to find ways of kind of combining all these together, like more apocalyptic photographs and the presentation kind of consistent with that aesthetic, and in just different ways. And so these are essentially remixes of my photographs from Iceland in 2018. And these are some more recent photographs. I think I have a new project I'm working on now on the salt marshes here in Maine. That's kind of something that is, again, threatened by both development and climate change issues. And so I've been going out and trying to photograph these salt marshes, but in a style that, or in a way that is kind of consistent with these other things I've been working on. So I'm excited about these, and I really love how the prints are coming out. And normally when I give these talks, I explain 20 times that the print looks better than what's on the screen. But I decided that's probably implied anyway. It's not, but they really do. So it's like, but that's true for everybody. It turns out, that the prints can usually look better than what's on the screen, and that's why we do this. Like my students this week taking a week-long workshop and learning how to print. So. Yeah, so that's all I have, and so happy to answer any questions people have about this. I think that's all. So, thanks.